Okay, Steve.
Okay, so, Mr. Hayman, why don't you tell me the story?
1451 time coding.
The story you told me before about how the families in the Depression had to pass the soup bones around. How you did that?
Sure. Ready?
Sure.
Times were tough in Somerset County during the Depression. I have a friend who lived in a small village west of Princess Anne, and he told me about his family. His mother went to the store and bought a soup bone, and she brought the bone home, and she made soup with it. And after she finished with the soup bone, she gave it to a neighbor. The neighbor made soup, and after she finished with it, she took it to her neighbor. And that neighbor made soup, and she took it to her neighbor on the other side of the street. And then the neighbor took it to another young couple, just married, and she made black-eyed peas with it, and that ruined the soup bone. Okay.
Sure. No, that's great. That's just what
Okay.
it is. Tell me about, we talked before, remember we talked about how times were tough and the fishermen and the
Yes, the barter.
bartering. Tell me a little about how the bartering worked on the Eastern
Okay, we didn't have much money then. The money was very, very scarce, and what we did, a lot of us in the country, we instituted a barter system. The watermen would go out on the river and tong oysters and catch crabs, and they would bring them home and then take them in their boat up the river to the farmers. And they would trade those seafood things to the farmers for eggs and chickens and things that their farmers had. And in that way, we got along fairly well. But we didn't have any surplus money, any money to throw away. But we lived during those times, but it was awfully tight. And the poorer people were more hard-pressed than we were because they were on the lower economic scale and they didn't have the facilities that we had. But fortunately, we live in a country that had a lot of trees and forests. And they would go out in the summertime, in the fall, and they would cut firewood and stack it, and that's what they would burn in the wintertime. They had little airtight stoves, and they would put a stick of wood in there, and it would burn and give them a lot of heat. So that way we got a lot of heat, free almost.
Great, good. Can you tell me about, you're talking about the poor people in the lower economic scale and
Yes.
that sort of thing.
Well,
Can you tell me about how, and you were telling me this before, how the black folks, the Negroes, as they were called then, and the white folks, how the race relations were, how people got along, and what did people do for each other. And,
Right.
and I remember when at one point you told me that they knew their place, and that's important.
right. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of blacks living in this county. I think it's about 70%. Maybe it could be a larger percentage than that, blacks. But we've always gotten along. We've never had any tensions. There's been harmony and peaceful all during my lifetime. And what we did, we respected their rights and they respected us. And they knew their place and we knew ours. And we looked out for them as much as we could, and they looked out for us. I can remember in the springtime going around these country roads, and in these colored churches they'd have their festivals. And they'd have a strawberry festival, and they were out there in their delightful little clothes and their horses and buggies and tables set up in white tablecloths, and they were having a grand time. And that's the way we lived. We lived that way. We had our festivals and they had theirs. And there was no tension as far as I can remember the whole time I came up in my life.
Great, thank you. Is this a problem here?
Is that about it?
Okay, that's all right.
Could we cut for a second?
Yeah, sure.
There is a little bit of...
Am I talking too loud?
No, you're fine. Everything's going. You're doing great.
No.
Okay, Steve.
I just wanted to follow when you said. I want to follow up what you said before when you said that 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 everybody knew their place. The Negroes knew their place. Whites knew their place. What do you mean when you say they knew their place?
Well, they didn't encroach on our.
I'm sorry. Could you start over and just say that the Negroes or the Coloreds or however you referred
Yeah.
to them back then?
Yeah, the color didn't encroach on our way of living, and by that we kept our distance as well as they did. We worked in our homes. The colored people worked in our homes. The colored women, and the colored men worked on the farms. They plowed and they picked strawberries and so forth and so on. But we each knew our place. We knew our place too. So we got along grand together. There's only one thing that happened. Shall I go into the
Sure.
rape? There's only one aberration that happened during that whole time that I can remember, and that was the rape that we had in Somerset County. And that was a black raped an old white woman. And people became incensed because of that. We had never had anything like that in the history of Somerset County. And the result was that we had a lot of people come in from other communities. We had people from Delaware, people from Virginia came in here, and they got to drinking and carousing, and they decided to lynch the victim, the colored man. So they did. And up until that time, everything was grand in Somerset County with the races. No problem. And it took a little while for that to blow over, to get back to normal again. For a while, we were very restrained, both races, and we watched our P's and Q's. But gradually, it came to pass that we operated like we did in the past.
Great. Thank you. Can you tell me, because I know you told me about this, can you go back now and just take a minute, and I know you've probably been thinking about it since we first met.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And tell me about the night that lynching happened and where you were, what you were doing, and what you saw, and how you came to see it, and that sort of thing.
Well, the night of the lynching, I had a date to play bridge, and my house was just about a block and a half from the jail. I remember hearing all these horrible yells and screaming. So I went out on my upstairs porch to see what was going on. And I looked across the street and I saw 5 big men trying to pull up a telephone pole. And then I realized maybe I should be careful where I would go that night because things were getting pretty much out of hand. Then we went to play bridge on a street or two from the main street, and we heard all the ungodly yells, and we didn't know what was happening. So we broke up the bridge party and came out on the main street to look and see what was going on. And there, about 2 or 3 blocks away, I could see this mob coming towards us. And perhaps there were about 300 or 400 people in the mob. And they were yelling and screaming, and it was just horrible what went on. So I walked out towards the middle of the street to where the mob was to see if I could recognize anybody. And I couldn't recognize a soul. I didn't know anybody was in that mob. But they were dragging the poor devil by a rope, had tied around his neck. Of course, he was dead. And by that time, the dirt and everything, he was sort of black and disheveled, just all over. And they took him and about 2 blocks from where we were standing and dumped him in a lumber yard. And that's where he was left that night.
Okay, can you cut for a second?
Of course, I can't remember that, but I'm sure they gathered in clusters and talked about it. I'm positive of that, but I can't remember actually what happened.
But you even said the next day that the people went to work normally. And
That's right.
That's all I'm asking.
Oh yeah. All right. So the next day after the lynching, the colored people who worked in their homes went to work like everybody else, and there was no difference there. And they were treated just the same as they were usual.
Okay. Thank you. What about the press? You said that there was a lot of press. I think we're going to have to cut, Michael. Hang on a second. This might be a long rant.
Okay, Stephen.
All right.
Okay, sir. Why don't you start with you addressing
Well, about every 2 weeks we had a bridge club. The four of us played. Same people played every 2 weeks. And I was dressing to go to the bridge club to meet with the boys, play the bridge. And I went out on my upstairs front porch. We only lived about a block and a half from the jail. And we heard all the screaming and so forth. And I looked across the street. There was a big telephone pole and four big people trying to pull it up and screaming. And then I realized maybe I shouldn't be out there. So I went back in and finished dressing. Then we played bridge for about maybe a half hour, and we heard all this screaming and yelling, and we didn't know what it was, so we broke up the bridge club, and we walked up on Main Street, all of us, to find out what was going on. And we looked south, and we saw what looked like about 300 or 400 people coming down the middle of the street. And until they got up pretty close to us, we didn't realize that they had a man on the end of a rope. I walked out in the street to see if I could recognize anybody, and which I couldn't. I didn't recognize anybody in that mob. And they took him about 2 blocks from us and put him in a lumber yard, and that's where he stayed all night, in a lumber yard.
Do you know what happened that night in the lumber yard? Did they just leave him there? Did people go to look at the body?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think the people, nothing but the mob went there, the townspeople.
Okay. So can you tell me again, when you saw a crowd of people coming down the street, was George Armwood alive? Was he dead? Were they pulling him by a rope? Can you tell me what you saw?
A couple blocks or 3 blocks away, we couldn't see anything but the group of people because the street light wasn't too good. And all we could see were the people moving back and forth and running up and down, but we didn't realize that they had a man on the end of a rope, which they did. And of course he was dead and wiggling around like they were, running up and down the street.
And then?
Then I walked out to see if I could recognize anybody, which I couldn't, and they kept on pulling the mob kept on pulling the man for a couple of blocks, and then they dumped him over in a lumber yard on a side street. And that's where the man stayed that night. That was the end of the man.
Great, great. Now afterwards, the city press, Baltimore Sun, they had some pretty harsh things to say about the folks, on the Eastern Shore.
Right.
That didn't sit well. What was it that the papers were saying, and how did the local people react to it, and what did they do? What was that situation?
Well, of course, the next day, the incident was in all the city papers, especially the Baltimore Sun and the Philadelphia Bulletin and the New York Times. It was well publicized on the East Coast. Everybody knew about it. And a lot of the reports were inaccurate. They told things that didn't happen, and they described things that didn't exist. And we were amazed, the local people were amazed to read the accounts in these city papers about what happened in Princess Anne, because a lot of it wasn't true. And we were criticized severely by Mr. H.L. Mencken of the Baltimore Sun, who at that time was in his prime and well-known and a good writer. But I questioned whether Mr. Mencken had ever been on the Eastern Shore. And I also questioned whether he ever knew anybody from the Eastern Shore. But he had his opinions, and they weren't good.
What were they?
Well, he called us uncivilized, rednecks, and uneducated. Everything he could think of, he put, and his Baltimore Sun printed it. At that time, I had just finished school, going to school in William and Mary, and the Baltimore Sun was considered one of 5 of the best papers in the United States. The Chicago Tribune, the New York Times.
That's
And
okay.
yeah.
Let's move on. What about the Baltimore Sun, though?
And then,
How
but
did people feel about the Baltimore
Yeah,
Sun
well,
after all that criticism?
But when I read the accounts in the Baltimore Sun, I was aghast. I couldn't believe that they would publish fabrications like they did. It upset me, and I lost some respect for the Baltimore Sun. And from that time on, I have not exactly followed the Baltimore Sun word for word. They'll probably come down and shoot me.
What the heck? Let me ask you something, though. Wasn't there kinds of actions? Didn't people, like you were telling me, people turned over trucks and canceled subscriptions? And I mean, wasn't there a lot of like retaliation on the part of the people?
Yes, there was. There was. After that time, of course, their subscriptions fell off. People refused to read the Baltimore Sun because they didn't believe in them. You couldn't trust the Baltimore Sun from what they was said. And it was a long time before they got their circulation back in Somerset County.
But you don't recall any incidents of violence towards drivers for the Baltimore Sun or turning trucks or any of that stuff? Did you know anything?
No, they didn't destroy any people.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they not to my knowledge.
Okay, fine. A month after the lynching, the National Guard came and we talked about this, came and arrested
Right.
4 people.
Yeah,
Right? There was a
right.
lot of trouble up in Salisbury
Right.
with the National Guard. Can you tell me, I mean, it was almost a riot. What happened? What happened and why did it happen? What got people so upset?
Well, give me a minute.
Sure. What
Well,
Take 5.
Okay, so you were saying shortly after about the Baltimore Sun, they were still saying.
the Baltimore Sun was still
I'm sorry. Just start by saying shortly after the incident.
shortly after that, the Baltimore Sun was still continuing to publish information about what happened in Somerset County. And it's my recollection that the people in the state of Maryland wanted something done. So Governor Ritchie, who was governor at that time, and an excellent governor, he sent the National Guard down here to try to find out who the culprits were. And they came down here, so he sent the National Guard, unbeknownst to the people in Somerset or Wycomico County. None of us knew that the Guards were coming. So they came down, and by the word of mouth, they picked out 4 people they thought were the ones who lynched the man. No search warrants were delivered. They just went and got the 4 people who were considered to be the ones who were instigators of the crime. And of course, the people got up in arms about that. We were invaded. A lot of them said we were invaded by our own National Guard. So, what happened? They had a court case in Somerset County in Princess Anne, and the National Guards were here, and of course the reporters came back from all the city newspapers, and there was quite a time, a lot of festivities going on. But they brought the prisoners in, and there was 2 or 3 of them were our main leaders in our citizens in our group. They were the stalwarts of our citizenry. And they were taken up to the courthouse before 2 judges. One was a chief judge and one was a local judge. And a hearing began. But what they found out, there was no testimony. Nobody could bring in any written testimony. Nobody could tell them anything. So they had to disband the court. There was nothing to try. And of course, by that time, the reporters were running wild with the telephones and so forth and so on. And that continued for a while. So it was quite a time in our experience.
What about when the reporters, these big city reporters who had been saying such bad things about the community, when they did come into the community, how did the people of the community react to them?
They didn't pay any attention to them.
Is that what it was?
They ignored them.
So they didn't give him the time. There was no confrontation
no,
between.
no.
Okay.
No.
Let me ask you something. I just want to get your opinion, and you can talk about this if you feel like you can. Why do you think this thing happened on the Eastern Shore? Why do you think it happened here? You know, it didn't happen in Baltimore. It didn't happen in Pennsylvania. You know, the people from the big city newspapers were very critical. Why do you suppose? What is it about this area that maybe made it possible for something like that to happen?
Well, I think it happened because we lived so closely together, the races. We, in the urban areas, people passed and didn't speak, and there was no feeling towards one another. They were just somebody, and that was it. But in our local community, we did converse with each other, and we looked after the welfare of the other people, the blacks, if we could. And we got to know them. We got to know them very well. And I think, which I'm not sure of, yeah.
53.
Go.
Take 6.
Okay, Steve.
We had never had a lynching in Somerset County, ever. So people were outraged. It was a heinous crime, especially on an old woman that didn't bother anybody and had a lot of friends. And I suppose the reason it happened maybe...
Sorry, excuse me. What you said was you hadn't had a lynching. I think what you meant to say, you never
I mean,
had
a rape, yeah.
An assault on a woman.
An assault, yeah.
Yeah.
Shall I
I
say
don't
it?
think it really was a rape. I think it was an assault.
Yeah,
Okay. So why don't you start? It's just you mixed up the words. But I
that's
think-
right.
Okay. go
Shall I
ahead.
repeat it?
Yes, please.
We had never had an assault on a poor white woman before in Somerset County, and people were enraged on it. They never experienced anything like that. And that's why perhaps our citizens didn't wait to let the law take its course. But in any community, in any country or city, you do have what we used to call a bunch of rednecks. And we had a few like everybody else. And they were the ones that promulgated this crime. The good thinking people of this county would never have done anything like that. It never crossed our mind to do anything like that, because we have always been law-abiding citizens, and the law is one that takes care of everything that they should have.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I just have one more question, and that was the thing about the banks and why it was so...
Yeah, I think that's important.
Okay, why don't you tell me about how the banks closed and didn't open up?
The reason why the Depression was much worse on us in this county was because in the northern part of the county we had 2 banks. And in Chrisfield, which is the southern part of the county, we had 2 banks. And most of the people in the upper part banked with our local 2 banks. And they closed during the Depression. During the government holiday, they closed. And when the time came to reopen, our banks didn't reopen in the northern part of the county because they were insolvent. They couldn't open. So that left us without any ready cash. The only cash we had was what women had in their sugar dishes and stuff hidden around like that. We didn't have any ready. So we had to provide some other way of living. And that's why Somerset County, the northern part of it, and Princess Anne and that area was hurt so much.
Great, thanks. Cut. So when you were out there on the street and you saw this mob, were you afraid? Were you angry? Were you upset? Did you want to run? Did you want to look more? What were the feelings that were going on in your stomach and in your...
Well, let's begin by my telling you my getting dressed for the card party. when I went out on the upstairs porch and saw those four men trying to pull up a telephone pole, I became frightened. I realized it wasn't any place for a person on the street because you didn't know what they would do. Then I had to walk to the card party, and that was about 3 or 4 blocks, and I was actually afraid. I was looking back at me and around me to see whether anybody was coming, but it so happened everybody was down the other end of the town, so I was all right. But when I walked out on the street to look at the mob to see if I could recognize somebody, I was frightened too. I didn't know, because then I realized for the first time that a lot of them were drunk and a lot of them were rednecks, and you didn't know what they would do. So I did go back right away on the sidewalk with the rest of the people.
But you did stay. You didn't go home.
No, I didn't go home.
What kept you on the sidewalk?
That's right.
What kept you on the sidewalk? Why did you stay?
It kept me on the sidewalk because people were still milling around and talking and yelling, and we wanted to see what would happen next. We didn't know what would happen. We didn't see any law people. We didn't see any police or sheriffs, so we didn't know what would happen. And that's why we stayed out there for a while until the crowd dispersed.
Well, was it like a party? I mean, was it a festive affair, or was it?
Well, it's hard to describe because I just don't know how to tell you. It wasn't festive at all. It was frightening. The whole thing was frightening. It really was. And that I will never forget it. You know, I'll carry it to my grave what I saw.
Thank you.
This will be take 8, 15, 42, 22.
Okay.
When I went out on the porch, I saw these 5 big men around a telephone pole, and they were trying to pull it up. And what they were trying to do was to get the telephone pole used as a battering ram to break the jail door in. But of course, the telephone pole was about 24 inches in diameter and well dug in, so they didn't do much with that. But they sure as hell did. You can't believe it.
So what did they finally break down the jail door with?
With a telephone pole.
So they did get it. Did they get it up?
No. But it was one, they have them lying around. You know how they get ready to put a new pole in. They found one and came back. No.